was having a couple of digital glitches, which of course is something that could come up. So yeah, Remotely Digital was Barnsley Museums. It was our first official online remote volunteering project, and we delivered that with funding from the National Lottery Heritage Fund. So we worked on our sound and film collection, which is a collection we hold in Barnsley Archives, which is a part of our service. And volunteers have transcribed and were summarising a whole range of different clips that relate to Barnsley's history, and making those clips therefore more accessible for everyone else who might want to access them and find out them. The project was a pilot, and it was to see how this type of volunteering could be done for us. And on the whole, it was quite a huge success, and we were really pleased with it in the end. So what did we do? So very briefly, as you can see on the screen, we recruited and trained a team of remote digital volunteers. We collated and converted our entire sound and film collection, which had previously been in a very bit of a mixed state in terms of how it could be used. We began to transcribe and summarize the collection, and I'll caveat that we did not transcribe and summarize the entire collection, but we did get through a fair chunk of it. We appointed a freelance professional, which added a lot of additional resource. The National Lottery asked us to produce a how-to guide, which you can find still online, along with all the other projects that produced that. And we created a blog and podcast about the experience, which is still available through our website. And we offered and supported volunteers with regular Zoom chats and online talks, etc. So what were the key outcomes of this project? So we originally wanted 12 volunteers, and we ended up with 65 over the course of the project. And we think that was down to the really high flexibility of this volunteer offer. People could do it at their own pace, in their own time, outside of working hours, etc. And some of that engagement was quite small. Some people had a go and then maybe decided it wasn't for them. Some people were with us for the duration of the project and are still continuing to volunteer with us. Pretty much every single volunteer had never volunteered with us before, so they were all brand new to Barnsley Museums and engaging with kind of our collections and heritage. 100 transcripts were worked on and completed and then published, which are now available for people to go and find through our catalogue, which means more of those clips than ever are now accessible and more easily understood, both by ourselves and the public. We have, leading to that, a new understanding of that collection. As I say, it was a bit disparate and kind of stored in a few different places. Some of it was in formats such as cassette tape, which were just not kind of easily, readily for us to look at. This allowed us to convert everything and give us a really good understanding. It created a volunteer offer that was definitely more diverse, which I'll come on to in a later slide. And just briefly mention a reduced carbon footprint. All things have a carbon footprint, and anything digital does as well. But this project did offer a way to reduce our travel carbon footprint for volunteers. And we had volunteers in Austria and New Zealand who obviously couldn't have volunteered with us previously and engaged with that collection. And finally, one of the key outcomes was that all the volunteers felt that they had gained and honed new skills in archival work, and felt that it had impacted them and allowed them to engage with the heritage. So how did we kind of do it very briefly? So as mentioned, we had freelance support. So we recruited a freelancer. Worth mentioning, we had to do that twice. So the first time we recruited, we didn't get anyone and we had to go out again. So we did have to kind of play around with the timescales a little bit. We set up a project team between myself as program manager for volunteering and our archives manager to kind of divide that responsibilities and understand who had kind of overview of what. I don't have a collections background. Obviously, our archives manager did. So we kind of worked on that together. We converted, as I say, a huge amount of material that had previously been on things like reel tapes, cine film, cassettes, which obviously ourselves and obviously none of the volunteers have really equipment to play them and to then send them out and access them as well. So the digital material, when converted, could then be uploaded to a cloud storage. We used SoundCloud, so that then URL links could be sent to volunteers who could then listen to those from their own homes. We did a range of recruitment and training for volunteers. So we did recruit via our existing networks and all the kind of places I guess most of us would do, social media, some of our existing volunteers, and things like the museum's job desks, which really helped generate a lot of interest. We did an online induction training session, which we also recorded, so we could then use again with later volunteers, so that we weren't having to continually repeat that resource. And then we developed a monthly program with a range of external speakers just to provide sector-specific insights to enhance the volunteer program and feel like they were still being connected, even though they were remote from us. And that also links into the digital volunteer management. So we had to do a range of one-to-ones. We used Zoom and email support. We did monthly newsletters. We offered in-person events where we could for those that wanted, as well as online ones as well that were kind of like general coffee chats and stuff like that. It did lead to us then evaluating and changing some of our guidance and policies. So again, we'd not really worked on remote volunteering before, so we did update our handbook and we created a new version of that specifically for online remote volunteers, new risk assessments, etc. And of course, we celebrated it and we had a number of events. Again, we had an in-person event, which meant our other archival volunteers that worked in the archive itself could be involved. And then we had an online event that allowed other people from across the project to come, as well as treating those celebrations in the same vein. So we did invite kind of the local mayor to the online event as well as the in-person event. So everyone was kind of getting the same level, if you like. I mentioned diversity at the beginning of the presentation, and that was an interesting outcome, that it gave us a volunteer diversity that maybe we don't always see in a more localized in-person offer that we have. So as I say, 65 people engaged, 20% of those volunteers identified as neurodivergent, and we did seek that group. And a lot of the feedback we got was that they were attracted to the offer because it allowed volunteering in your own space, which was very appealing and allowed kind of you to manage the time you wanted to put to the project in your own way. 27% of people identified as not being heterosexual. That wasn't a group we targeted, but I thought it was really interesting to note because it is much, much higher than the percentage our in-person offer gets in terms of people identifying within the LGBTQ plus community. 24% identified as not white British, again, a much higher percentage than our overall in-person offer. Barnsley's demographics are white British predominantly, 96% of the population in the census identified that way. So again, at a localized level, that more kind of racial diversity is quite challenging. This project allowed us to really expand and work with different communities that we'd not been able to before. And finally, 81% identify within the age range of 18 to 49, which is a bit of a flip of our in-person demographic, which traditionally sits more heavily in the 50 plus, kind of into retirement, and maybe that slightly younger demographic work experience kind of range. So it did show that people could fit this offer around their time and work commitments and other patterns that they had in their life, because it wasn't demanding that traditional you come into the building when we're open kind of approach. Some insights that we kind of got from the project, and the biggest one I think was to be flexible and that we had to adapt to the needs of the volunteers and the training and resources that we needed to provide. Some volunteers, we had a kind of idea of what we wanted to do around volunteer software for transcribing. Some volunteers found that incredibly tricky to use and actually went to a method that was more around Word documents and media player, which took a bit longer in some places, but it was how they could make that work, and we needed to have that flexibility in the offer. Some people required lots of regular catch-ups, Zoom meetings to talk through the work they were doing. Some didn't. Some were happy with after the initial kind of introduction to then crack on and then come back to us if they did need anything, or to us to review their work. The output was the same. However much kind of support was given, a transcription or summary was completed, but the process, support and time to complete that differed from volunteer to another. Again, as volunteer coordinators, we won't be surprised by that. But again, it's worth noting that that is true in an online offer, and perhaps even slightly more so because of that remote nature. And it can, as I say, moving on to the next point, take up a little bit more time and have to be quite flexible in that time. So our freelance resource was really useful here because they also worked those hours very flexibly. So they might work a little bit on a weekend or in an evening, and that meant they were responding to volunteers in a slightly more timely way and in a way that also suited the volunteer and could arrange meetings, etc., that also suited the volunteers, e.g., after kind of working hours, stuff like that. And ultimately, the final insight, which again, I feel like most of us as volunteer coordinators will not be surprised by, is that online volunteering still rewards like any other type of volunteering. So volunteers all fed back that the project had been interesting and rewarding and was something they had really enjoyed. They also felt that they'd contributed to preserving the heritage, and their own personal development was cited still as a real big part of what happened. That sense of well-being is something you see across all types of volunteering, and it just allowed us to give that to more volunteers who hadn't been traditionally able to work with us. So some of the challenges, volunteer dropout was, so I say 65 people, but we did see quite a lot of fluctuation within that 65. And I think that's something we know as volunteer coordinators, but we had to have an ongoing recruitment of new remote volunteers that had to be planned in quite regularly. And that was where we then set up a standard introduction to the project templates and those recorded online resources so that we weren't having to continuously set up induction sessions. We could send out the material via, we recorded it and stored it on YouTube. So then people could ask us questions independently as opposed to trying to arrange a lot of group sessions. Signposting and not diagnosing, I think, again, like all volunteering, some volunteers seek more support than others, both in the technical element, but also with their personal issues. And we still need to bring all of our volunteer management skill to the table, but we are recognizing we're delivering that in a different way and be prepared to manage situations still in a professional and mindful way, listening and show that you support, but still remembering that you can only do so much and you can only signpost appropriately. And actually, some of that signposting might be a little bit more complicated because the volunteer may not be in your local area, they may be further afield. So kind of recognizing still where your boundaries and lines are in terms of volunteer management and how much support you can and can't offer. That which leads into obviously managing expectations, both from the volunteer, but also from ourselves. So due to the flexible nature, some volunteers did take longer than others to complete a task. One volunteer, just as an example, took over a year to complete a transcript because they were fitting it in around lots of other things in their lives. This was okay for us because we'd kind of laid that out in the bid that we were piloting it and not sure how it would go. But you do need to factor that in, I guess, when you recruit and think about that when you're kind of designing the opportunity. CC4 licensing, I mentioned very briefly. For anyone who's not familiar with CC4 licensing, it's something that is an open license that allows anyone to make use of the material you release. And it was required that all of our digital material came under CC4 licensing by our funder. We could request exemptions to that, such as oral histories that were maybe politically sensitive or contained certain material. But it led to a further conversation with us about if we're going to work with people that require CC4 licensing or other types of licensing, perhaps that are open access as well. We need to consider this when working with communities and gathering their stories and understanding what it might mean for collections and then the publishing of that material and our relationships with the people that we've collected that from. So I just wanted to highlight licensing implications on a digital project. So what the volunteers told us, you can see on the screen some of those things there. I won't read them all out, but what the feedback told us was that ultimately this type of volunteering is needed and it was wanted. Having someone to support who both understood the task and its technicalities was essential to the volunteers. So it really justified us seeking further funding, which we're currently in the process of doing, to create a kind of, I guess, digital volunteer coordinator or an online volunteer coordinator as a role in itself. So I just wanted to kind of feed that back, that really rewarding, but definitely needs that level of resource. And then what next and kind of recommendations. So we have continued to deliver the project. even though it ended kind of a few months ago, but it is at a much reduced capacity. So the number of volunteers has shrunk back in, and that is definitely due to the fact that we no longer have resource for someone to spend that real more in-depth time with each volunteer. So we have seen a bit more of a drop-off, but we do have a small dedicated group that are continuing to get involved and continuing to transcribe. There is a huge amount of material, so I don't know what collections people might be working on, but for us, our sound and film collection is massive. So there's still a lot to work on, and in a way, it's given us a set of potential other projects that we could put forward by kind of organising that collection into certain different pockets and different themes. We might be able to then look at other pots down the line. I say we're chasing that dedicated resource to regrow and expand. I think we've kind of seen before that NCVO and other bodies are advocating for flexible volunteering offers as the future of volunteer engagement. But to meet that, we need to recognise that, to meet this high flexibility, we need a highly flexible and adapting resource to match it, to maintain that continuity for our organisation. Ultimately, though, this did allow us to shine a really positive light on a part of our collection that had not previously been fully understood and looked at, and to work on it more confidently. So on the whole, super positive, a super good example of how you can work with volunteers online. It did teach us a lot and did require a lot of kind of input from us, but has yielded some really great results. I'll just stop sharing my slides right now. I'm happy to chat through any questions.
Lovely, thanks so much, Ben. And I think that's a huge whistle-stop tour through a comprehensive project. So we have got some questions for you, which I'm going to share with you. The first one, very basic. I'm sure you'll be happy with this, but you're happy to share your slides with anyone who wants to?
Absolutely, yeah.
Perfect, lovely. So the first one that I'm going to share with you from Chloe. What changes did you make to your volunteering guidance and policies to make this project work?
So I guess we looked at things that didn't apply almost. So our volunteer handbook has things like no smoking in any of our buildings, no mobile phones, things like that, which obviously in someone's home is a completely irrelevant point to make. They can smoke and vape and go on their phones as much as they like. So we took out those kind of things that were about the buildings and about things that wouldn't really impact the volunteers. We added in some stuff around things like, so there's some great NHS guidance about desk assessment and how to work in like a DSE, if people are familiar with that term. So we added some basic tips and hints about setting up a workspace and how you might want to consider, only working on a transcript for a certain period of time, taking regular rest and breaks. So it was those kind of changes that I mean. I'm happy to share the handbook that we came up with. By no means do I feel it's necessarily the be all and end all. It certainly can be adapted, but yeah, it was just kind of rethinking about actually what is relevant to online volunteers and what should we be maybe offering a bit of guidance and signposting on because of that unique role.
Yeah, and it's really interesting, isn't it? Because you do set up a lot of these procedures for on-site volunteering quite often. Actually, it is quite irrelevant, actually, when you think about it. Did you include, out of interest, anything around kind of online safety or anything like that?
A little bit, yeah. So we kind of looked at some of our safeguarding things again that we'd use in person and thought about how we might adapt those. So made some links to online safety. That was also in our risk assessment around our own safety, working one-to-one online with someone. So yeah, we kind of put some hints and tips, I guess, in about being safe online as well.
Brilliant, lovely. Next question. I think this is probably the last question, and then we'll move on to a little bit of discussion and then to Chris. Did you carry out any vetting on the volunteers who took part? For example, referencing or interviews? How did you sort of get them involved?
We didn't do any vetting in the sense of references or interviews. That's also true of our in-person offer. So we carried that forward into the online offer. We used email to get to know them a little bit. We arranged induction chats if they wanted to, which is again in person. I might have said let's meet at the gallery for a little chat about the volunteer role. And then we kind of went from there from them. Because they did have to sign up through the handbook to things like copyright, and that anything they produced didn't belong to them, and that if they were going to be working on a clip, it needed to be deleted once it had been used and things like that. So no, there wasn't like a kind of references vetting process in that sense, but we used some of those other mechanisms to get to know them and understand what they were looking for.
Brilliant. That's really interesting. And it's a really interesting question following the last session we had, which was all about kind of the barrier-free engagement of volunteering, and the fact that a lot of organizations put these processes in place at the beginning that can create barriers. So that's really interesting to note, and it might be partially why you had such a lovely diverse range of people getting involved as well. So
I believe
really
so.
interesting. Who knows whether the correlation is there. Lovely. That was really fascinating, Ben, and I really appreciate you sharing your story. And I think the thing that we're really keen on doing in HVG is sharing case studies. So if you ever want to share one, please do get in touch with me. But they don't ever need to be fully formed case studies or fully perfectly run case studies. Ben was very frank about what worked and what didn't, and that's very much what we can learn as a group. So please do